Howdy YouTube, and welcome to today's tutorial on advanced stereo imaging. So what I mean by advanced is using the stereo image to give your music a realistic sense of depth. So by contrast, there's a lot of basic stereo effects out there which make your music sound quote unquote wider. And that's cool because listeners generally prefer wide sounds to an extent. So the intermediate level of stereo imaging is just learning to control these basic effects to make your music wide but not too wide. But today I am going to jump right over the basic and intermediate stuff, and instead I'll be sharing with you an advanced technique I have been working on which uses acoustic simulation to calculate an effect which very convincingly places your instruments into a real space. So the end result doesn't only sound wide, but it also has a realistic sense of depth. So if you close your eyes, you can sort of picture yourself in that space with all the instruments separated in front of you and projecting their sound at you clearly. I hope I'm not overpromising, but I am super excited about this technique, so let's jump right in. Alright, so let me first show you the effect we're going to be using. So the backbone or the engine of this effect is convolution reverb, and I'm using Convology XT because it's free, but you could use any convolution reverb that allows you to import your own impulse responses. And the devil's all in the details for this technique. It's all about how we're going to set up these impulse responses for a realistic stereo image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simulate impulse responses, and I'll show you how I do simulation at the end of the video. But basically this is going to give us impulse responses for like how our instrument will sound acoustically in different positions in the theater. So let me show you what a couple of those sound like. So remember, for full effect, you'll be wanting to listen on headphones since we're talking about a stereo image, but those all have subtle differences and essentially like how there's different delays, echoes, and even colorization like EQ, since the theater would be boosting or attenuating different frequencies depending on where you're sitting and where the instruments are located. So that's all simulated here, and what we're going to do is assign a different impulse response for each instrument. So we'll have the cellos sitting in one location in the instrument, violas in another, and the violins in another. And then our brain's going to be able to sort of like figure out all these differences in the stereo field. And when you close your eyes, you can really get immersed in this. So let me first show you what this sounds like with all the convolution disabled. Then let me enable the convolution. And then let me do one more before and after without any talking between. Wow, isn't that amazing? It's literally night and day. All right, next let's compare this with a real impulse response. So I will choose this Willis Hall, which was recorded in some realistic theater, and then I'm going to key map the enable button to a hotkey so I can put this on each track and easily enable, disable it. Key map this one as well, and copy and key map this one as well. Great, so now I can turn on this Willis Hall one and also turn on and off our simulated impulse response. So let's hear one more time dry. And then let's turn on the real impulse response. So what I notice is that our simulated impulse response actually sounds more open than the real impulse response. And I think the main reason for that is that this Willis Hall, we only have one impulse response. So I guess in the ideal case, we would have an impulse response at like different locations in a real theater. Because I mean, getting a real impulse response should always be better than a simulated one. But it's just the fact that this like one single impulse response only represents the acoustics at one location, versus in my simulated version, we can represent it at all these different locations, and that's how we're getting the realistic depth. And now let me do one more before and after without any talking between. So here's the real one first. And that was the simulated 1 second. And another thing I will mention about it is I noticed that this real impulse response, it starts to sound sort of like boxy, or like it's like all the resonances are overlapping. Versus it's not just the stereo image that's more open. To me, it's also sort of like the EQing that becomes more open. And I think that's because the impulse response doesn't just affect the stereo, it doesn't just affect like the reverb, it also colorizes the sound. It boosts and attenuates some frequencies. And so when we have the same impulse response on each track, we're sort of boosting and attenuating the same frequencies, and it starts to sound sort of like boxy or overlapping. Whereas the simulated impulse response will have a slightly different frequency response on each track. And I think that's going to help things sort of separate. Let's do that one more time. Yeah, I honestly prefer the simulated version in this case. All right, next let's talk about where the simulated impulse responses come from. So in my previous video, I had a very in-depth tutorial on how to use this Google Colab project for room acoustic simulation. So I won't go as in-depth this time, but if you need more explanation, just check out my previous video. So let's see. First you'll want to follow the link in the description of this video to open the project. And then after you install all the packages and dependencies, what we're going to do is create this simulated room, which is the dimension. It's kind of this black outline is our virtual room or theater. These blue circles, squares, and triangles are the different like locations of our impulse responses. So like we could say have the cellos where the square is, the violas where this triangle is, and so on. And then this X is the listening position. And it's actually a stereo listening position. So if I go up to here where we define things, the microphone, there's actually two values in the X position, two values in the Y as well as in the Z. And the Y and the Z are the same, so it's kind of like your ears are the same height and you're the same distance from the front of the theater. But then the X position, there's a slight offset. And it's actually pretty exaggerated. It's a meter apart, so it'd be like if you had a gigantic pumpkin head or something. And you can only really see one X because it's still relatively quite close together. If I put these further apart at, say, like 50 meters and 70 meters, it doesn't really matter which values, but just far enough apart, you can now see like they're distinctly visually see. It's not like a smiley face, but yeah, the two X's are the different microphone positions. But to make it like a little more realistic, I'm going to put them just a meter apart, and that is going to be the stereo listening position, and the dimensions of the different sources, it's pretty much the same thing. We'll just have like a X, Y, Z position for each location of the theater, and you can kind of go down to this visualization and check that they're in the right spots. And then the dimensions of the theater are up here, and we can modify this and show you what that would look like. Maybe we can do an example at the end of the video with a modified room. So let's try maybe a little smaller, more intimate theater. Like my previous theater, I don't know if you noticed in the demos, it was so big that there was like audible echoes. In fact, I probably want to almost like half the size of this. Let's say it's like 60, 80. And then we'll also want to make maybe all these numbers like half. So 30, 15, 60, and 45. I'm not 100% sure if this is going to work. Well, let's take a look. Don't need to do that. Okay, so that didn't work. Okay, so this is telling us the reason that didn't work is now all of a sudden my sources were outside the dimensions of my theater, which of course is like impossible. You can't simulate that. So I went back and changed these to the original values in the X dimension, and we're just going to make this like a shallower theater. So now if I enter those values and then display the room, we can see now this is like a shallower, still a more intimate theater, but it's the same width as before. So moving along, you can define the acoustic materials. Maybe we can make this theater have a little bit drier, or let's say like more absorptive walls, and maybe we can make the ceiling also more absorptive, but the floor more reflective. So basically, if you make this value higher, it's going to make your material more absorptive, and if you make it smaller, it's going to make it more reflective. And maybe we can also make it more scattering. Let's just try it out. We'll see what it sounds like. And then this last stage is where we're going to get the impulse response. And unlike the last video where I just got a single impulse response to sort of analyze the acoustics of my recording studio, in this case, we're going to get all these different impulse responses for the different sources and the stereo microphones. So this is like this source 0 is our stereo impulse response for that first location, and so on. And you can see they all look quite similar. If you stare at them long enough, you'll see there's subtle differences, but it's kind of like a same but different scenario. But that's good, right? That's part of what's going to make these impulse responses sound like they're in the same room, just with very subtle differences on each channel. So that's basically it. We have the impulse responses. Now, just to get it out of Google Colab, I think this was just debugging. You don't really need this step. And then down here, this is where I'm going to write it. And actually, I want to rename this. I'm going to call this Simulated Theater B, so I don't overwrite my original one. So yeah, this script is basically just going to export it. I label it so you have like the XYZ dimensions in the output impulse response, just to kind of keep track of things. But you can really name the files whatever you want. And then they're over here. And now I can download, I guess I have to download these all individually. All right, and now that I have these impulse responses somewhere I can find them, let's open up yet another instance of Convology XT, or whatever convolution reverb you have. And now we can open up this Theater B. And I'm going to do a different instance, so maybe we can do an A-B test. Hey, it's literally Theater A versus Theater B. It's like a real A-B test. So yeah, let's compare these. And I'm also going to set up that hotkey like I did before, so that I can easily enable and disable this. And then let's drag this to violas and choose the center one. I wonder how they actually set up an orchestra. The violas probably aren't centered. Maybe the cellos would be. I don't know. Doesn't matter. And then the violins will have on the far right side, I guess. Stage right. And yeah, we should be able to... Oh, I need to add the hotkey to each track. That's annoying. I wish Ableton, when you copied a plugin, I wish that it would keep the hotkeys. Okay, so now we can enable disable Theater B. We can enable disable Theater A. Let's do a real A-B test. I'll play the dry orchestra first, then I'll play Theater A, and then Theater B. Let's hear what that sounds like. Cool. So there's definitely a big difference between these theaters. Namely, theater A has an audible echo, whereas theater B, there's a small echo, but it's barely noticeable. It kind of, it's much shorter echo, and it's also damper, so it just dies really quick. So there you have it. There's a way to simulate different rooms. More importantly, there's a way for you to place your instruments in a realistic space in the room. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways you could go about this. Instead of doing simulated acoustic or impulse responses, you could go out there and record impulse responses from different parts of your same room. You could also get really good at using those basic tools I mentioned at the beginning, like Haas effect and delay and EQ, and all of these things. Like, you should be able to, in theory, recreate the impulse response if you took enough time and effort, because they're all just linear systems. But basically, I think that would be a lot harder. I think the simulation method is the easier way. It's a principled way of creating a realistic stereo image. It'd be really cool if someone packaged this up. That might already exist. I'm really, maybe surprisingly, not a plugin guru at all. I have like no idea what plugins are out there. I kind of purposefully keep my collection somewhat small-ish, so I can manage like learning each plugin. So there's a lot of people out there. All I'm saying is that know more plugins than me. Let me know. Maybe this already exists in a plugin out there, simulating different positions in a room. If not, it'd be really cool if someone did. I actually was just chatting with the creator of PyRoom Acoustics, that Python package, last week. He saw my post on Reddit, so I chatted with him. Maybe he'd be a good guy to talk to about getting that plugin going if it doesn't exist already. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I was really happy about the outcome of this video. That's probably one of the more successful attempts at creating room acoustics I've had. So yeah, please give it a like and subscribe if this was helpful for you, and I will see you next time.